I used to think there was nothing more peaceful than solo camping. Just me, a tent, and the immense comforting silence of the forest. I'd been doing it for years, always seeking out the most remote spots on the map, places where the trails faded and you could go days without seeing another soul. That was the whole point. The solitude was the prize. My last trip, however, taught me that you're never truly alone. The spot was deep in a national forest, a good 6-mile hike from where I left my car. I set up my small one-man tent in a clearing by a creek. The gurgling water, a perfect natural white noise machine. The first night was bliss. I cooked my dinner over a small stove, watched the stars come out through the canopy, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and flowing water. The second night, the silence was different. It felt heavy, pressed in. The usual forest chatter was gone. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't a woodpecker, and it wasn't a falling branch. It was methodical. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out, my headlamp cutting a nervous beam through the darkness. Nothing, just the impenetrable wall of trees. I told myself it was a pine cone dropping in a weird way, or some animal I didn't recognize. I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found a small, perfectly balanced cairn of 7 stones on the creek bank, right where I got my water. I hadn't built it. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker passed through silently while I was asleep. A strange but harmless greeting. Still, the feeling of being watched started to creep in, a prickle on the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I decided to pack up and leave a day early. The peace was shattered. I spent the day on edge, my hand never far from the can of bear spray on my hip. As dusk fell, I crawled into my tent for one final, restless night, planning to leave at first light. That's when I heard the new sound. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was a slow, wet scrape. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy, saturated log through the dirt. It started at the edge of the clearing and began to circle my tent. Slower than a walk, a deliberate, dragging pace. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held my breath, listening. The scraping stopped directly outside my tent. Silence. Then a low, guttural breathing. It wasn't an animal. Animal breathing is rhythmic, natural. This was shallow and ragged, the sound of a human trying to be quiet. It was so close, I could almost feel the vibration through the thin nylon wall. I was paralyzed, a cold sweat breaking out all over my body. My mind went blank with pure, primal terror. I finally found my voice and let out a guttural yell, grabbing my heaviest flashlight and swinging it wildly against the side of the tent. The breathing stopped. I heard a single, heavy footstep receding into the woods, and then nothing. I sat there shaking until the sun came up. When I finally dared to crawl outside, I saw it. The wet, scraping sound hadn't been a log. Someone had been dragging their finger or a stick through the mud and wet leaves, carving a deep trench in the earth. It formed a perfect circle around my tent, and inside the circle, scrawled over and over in the damp soil, was the same simple phrase, "I like to watch you sleep." Enjoyed the scare? Tap like and hit subscribe for more weekly horror. The spot wasn't on any official map, a little clearing my friend Mark had told me about years ago. Deep in the pines, totally secluded, he'd said. You won't see another soul. He was right. After a 2-hour hike from the main trail, I pitched my tent in a perfect circle of grass, surrounded by a dense wall of ancient trees. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine sap and damp earth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was why I did this, to escape the noise, the people, the relentless hum of the city. I got a small fire going, cooked my dinner, and watched the embers glow as total darkness enveloped the woods. The familiar night sounds began, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of a distant owl, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a symphony of solitude. I was just about to crawl into my sleeping bag when I heard it, a soft tapping. It was rhythmic, tap, 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 tap. It sounded like a stone being struck against a tree, maybe 50 yards away. I told myself it was a woodpecker, though it seemed odd for one to be active so late. I zipped up my tent, settled into my sleeping bag, and tried to ignore it, but the sound was persistent, a needle-thin annoyance in the vast silence. After 10 minutes, it stopped. The sudden absence of the noise was somehow more jarring than the noise itself. I lay there, ears straining, but all I could hear now was the thumping of my own heart. An hour must have passed. I was finally drifting off when a new sound startled me awake. It was a scraping, a dry, dragging noise against the forest floor, and it was closer, much closer. I fumbled for my high-powered flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. Unzipping the tent just enough to poke the lens through, I flicked it on. The powerful beam cut a brilliant white tunnel through the blackness, illuminating tree trunks and patches of ferns. I swept the light back and forth, but saw nothing. No animal, no person, just the woods looking back at me. I retreated back inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. My rational mind was screaming at me. It's a branch, a boar, a deer. But another, more primal part of me knew better. The scraping started again, and this time, it was right outside. It was circling my tent, a slow, deliberate drag in the dirt and leaves. It went all the way around, once, then twice. My breath hitched in my throat. I was paralyzed, a trapped animal waiting for the inevitable. Then, the scraping stopped. It stopped right beside my head, separated from me by only a thin layer of nylon. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears hurt. That's when I heard it, the one sound I will never, ever forget. A breath, a slow, wet, rattling inhale, followed by a long, quiet exhale. It wasn't the panting of a wolf or the snuffling of a bear. It sounded patient. It sounded human, but wrong. Sick. I lay there, rigid with terror, for what felt like an eternity. Every few seconds, the sound would repeat. Inhale, exhale, a calm, steady rhythm of absolute menace, just inches from my ear. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just prayed for the sun to rise. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the tent fabric, the breathing was gone. I waited for a long time, listening to the silence. Eventually, shivering, I forced myself to look outside. The clearing was empty. There were no footprints, no sign of any person or animal. But as my eyes scanned the ground, a cold dread washed over me. Scratched into the dirt around my tent was a perfect, unbroken circle, and right where the breathing had been, placed neatly beside my tent door, was a small, muddy hiking boot, the exact match to the one I'd found and tossed aside when I first arrived at the clearing yesterday. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. I've always found a deep sense of peace in being alone in the woods. I'm not a thrill seeker, just a man who appreciates the profound silence that can only be found miles from any road. For my annual solo trip, I chose a remote section of the Cascade Range, a place known for its dense, old-growth forests and lack of cell service. It was perfect. The first day was bliss. I set up my camp in a small clearing surrounded by a fortress of ancient firs, their scent thick in the cool air. The night was uneventful, filled with the familiar comforting sounds of the forest settling down. The strangeness began on the second day. I was hiking a few miles from my camp, following a barely there game trail, when I saw it. Carved into the bark of a massive Douglas fir was an eye. It wasn't a crude doodle. It was anatomically perfect, with a detailed iris and pupil, etched so skillfully it seemed to possess a genuine depth. It was looking right at me. The carving was fresh, the wood beneath the bark still pale and damp. I felt a prickle of unease. It was odd, but I figured it was just some wandering artist with a peculiar hobby. I turned back towards my campsite, but the feeling of being watched lingered. A few hundred yards later, I found another carving on a different tree, a perfectly rendered human ear. Then, closer to my camp, a hand, its fingers slightly curled, then a mouth, parted as if in mid-sentence. They were all fresh, all unnervingly realistic. It felt like someone was deconstructing a person piece by piece along the trail, a trail that was leading directly to my clearing. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl felt amplified and sinister. Then I heard a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. I grabbed my high-lumen flashlight and unzipped my tent, shining the beam into the oppressive darkness. Nothing. The forest was still, but as soon as I zipped the tent shut, the tapping started again, this time from a different direction. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and I was beginning to feel very much like the mouse. The next morning, my blood ran cold. On a tree at the very edge of my clearing, one I would have seen yesterday, was a new carving. It was a full face combining the features I had seen on the trail, the eye, the ear, the mouth, into a single, horrified expression. The face was contorted in a silent scream, and beneath it, scratched crudely into the bark, was a small, unmistakable drawing of my tent. That was it. I was leaving. I didn't care about packing neatly. I just started shoving everything into my pack, my hands shaking. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe at the edge of the woods. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack, I heard it again. The tapping. Not from the trees this time. It was closer. It was on the taut fabric of my tent, right behind my head. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, patient, and deliberate. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming. I could hear something else now, too. A faint, wet sound, like shallow breathing through congested lungs. It was inches away, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. Holding my breath, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could reach, my maglite, and with a raw yell, I ripped open the tent flap and lunged outside. There was nothing. The clearing was empty. The air was deathly still. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any movement, but found none. Then I looked down. Lying on the pine needles, exactly where the tapping had come from, was a small, perfectly smooth river stone. Painted on its surface in what looked like dark berry juice or something else was a single, staring eye. I left the tent, the stove, everything. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't look back until my car was a tiny speck in my rearview mirror. I still have that stone. I keep it locked in a box in my garage. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and I'm the only one awake, I swear I can hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from inside it.